For centuries, Europe industrialized. Africa did not. This difference is often explained in a single sentence. Europe was smarter. Or more politely, Europe developed better institutions. But that answer is too clean, and history is rarely clean. Because before factories, before steam engines, before industrial capital, Africa was not behind. In fact, for most of human history, Europe was not ahead at all. So the real question is not why Europe industrialized. The real question is why Africa followed a completely different path. To understand that difference, we need to go far back in time. Long before colonialism. Long before borders. Long before the Industrial Revolution. We need to begin with geography. First, geography. Africa is not poor because it is empty. It is poor because it is vast. Africa is larger than the United States, China, India, and Europe combined. But its population, historically, was spread thin. Unlike Europe, Africa has very few long, navigable rivers that connect deep inland regions to the sea. The Nile is an exception. The Niger bends inward. The Congo is broken by rapids. The Zambezi ends in waterfalls. In Europe, rivers connected people. In Africa, rivers often isolated them. This mattered more than it sounds. Because industrialization does not begin with machines. It begins with density. You need people living close together. You need cities that trade constantly. You need surplus food to free labor from farms. And you need reliable transport to move goods cheaply. Europe had all of that, largely by accident of geography. Africa did not. But geography alone is not destiny. Africa developed complex societies, just in a different direction. Across West Africa, powerful states like Mali and Songhai controlled gold, salt, and trans-Saharan trade. In East Africa, Swahili city-states linked Africa to the Indian Ocean economy. In Central and Southern Africa, societies adapted to forest, savanna, and seasonal rainfall. These were not primitive systems, they were optimized systems. Africa did not lack intelligence. It lacked pressure. That brings us to population and land. In Europe, land was scarce. Population growth pushed people against ecological limits. Forests were cut. Soil was exhausted. Competition intensified. Scarcity forced innovation. When land becomes tight, you intensify agriculture. When labor becomes expensive, you mechanize. In much of Africa, land was abundant. People adapted by moving, not by intensifying. If soil was exhausted, you shifted fields. If rainfall failed, you migrated. If conflict arose, you dispersed. This flexibility was rational. It was resilient. But it did not create factories. Then came energy. Europe industrialized not just because of steam engines, but because of fuel. Coal changed everything. Europe sat on dense, accessible coal deposits close to rivers, cities, and ports. Africa did not. Coal existed in Africa, but often far from population centers, deep inland, without transport infrastructure. Energy determines scale. Without cheap, concentrated energy, industrialization stalls. Europe escaped its ecological limits. Africa did not need to, and later, could not. After that came colonialism. This is where many explanations stop. But colonialism did not simply pause African development, it restructured it. European powers did not colonize Africa to industrialize it. They colonized Africa to extract from it. Colonial economies were designed to move raw materials outward, not to build value inward. Railways were built, but not to connect African cities to each other. They ran from mines to ports. Institutions were created, but not to protect local industry. They protected extraction. Education systems trained clerks, not engineers. Borders were drawn to manage territory, not economies. Industrialization requires internal feedback loops. Capital reinvestment. Skilled labor. Domestic markets. Colonial Africa was deliberately excluded from those loops. Even after independence, industrialization did not simply begin. Because industrialization is not something you turn on. It requires conditions that take generations to accumulate. Europe industrialized slowly, over centuries of urbanization, state building, war, and competition. Africa entered the modern world suddenly, with borders it did not choose, economies it did not design, and global markets already dominated. And unlike Europe, Africa industrialized in a world where industrial powers already existed. Late development is harder. Factories do not appear where wages are lowest. They appear where supply chains already work. There is another factor that often goes unnoticed. Disease. Africa's disease environment historically reduced population density and long-term labor accumulation. Malaria, sleeping sickness, yellow fever, they shaped settlement patterns for centuries. This limited urban continuity. European cities grew uninterrupted for hundreds of years. African cities often rose and fell with ecological and disease cycles. Industrialization thrives on stability. Africa's environments rewarded adaptability instead. So when people ask why Africa did not industrialize like Europe, they assume there was a single missed opportunity. There was not. Africa followed a different equilibrium, one that worked for its geography, climate, and social systems. Europe's path was not superior by default. It was simply optimized for a different environment. Industrialization was not inevitable. It was contingent. Today, Africa is often described as catching up. But that framing is misleading. Africa is not behind Europe's past. It is navigating a different future. Industrialization itself is changing. Automation reduces labor advantages. Digital infrastructure bypasses factories. Renewable energy decentralizes power generation. Africa may never replicate Europe's industrial path, and it does not need to. The real paradox is this. Africa did not fail to industrialize. It optimized for survival in a world that had not yet become industrial. Europe industrialized early and reshaped the world in its image. Africa is now forced to industrialize late, inside a system it did not create. That is not a failure of intelligence. It is a collision of timelines. History does not move in straight lines. It moves in paths shaped by land, energy, density, and chance. Africa's path was different, not deficient. And understanding that difference matters more than assigning blame. Because the future will not reward imitation. It will reward systems that fit their world. This is Behind the Map.